I couldn't be bothered to think of a more detailed intro, so let's get right into it. The Red War, also known as the War of Annihilation or the Central Powers Soviet War, was a major conflict in the world of Orbis spanning from May to December of 2123. For immersion purposes, I'm going to explain these events while breaking the fourth wall as little as possible outside of this introduction. For a bit of context, in early 2123 Europe looked like this. The largest country, in the place of modern Russia, was the Soviet Federation, which had dominated Russia, albeit not continuously, for the better part of the 22nd century so far. They had suffered past defeats such as the 2113 to 2114 Tungsten War, which the link to that video will be in the description, and they had gone through some periods of non-Soviet governance, but by the 2120s the Soviet regime had been restored and the Soviets had begun to spread their influence around the world. Many other nations in the world were not particularly fond of this. Raritania, which was the main successor to the JGP in the United States, was at this time under the very hawkish, militarily anti-communist administration of President Revin Ormil, who had earlier organized a coalition called the Alliance to Resist Communist Hegemony, or ARCH, to oppose the Soviets in their United Eastern Coalition. Other countries, such as Iran, which was now under a constitutional monarchy following its civil war in the 2110s, and the United Boer Republic were also opposed to the Soviets. ARCH itself had sort of fallen apart by this point, but the alliance's influence endured, and many other alliances adopted anti-communist and anti-Soviet positions as well. In May of 2123, the Soviets began to press claims on the Empire of Sigurdheim, demanding the cession of Sjælland. Sigurdheim, of course, refused these demands. As a result, on May 19, 2123, the Soviets declared war on Sigurdheim and launched Operation Thunderous Beacon, bombing Sigurdian defenses and naval assets across Denmark while preparing an expeditionary force. This alarmed many of the world's nations, as 2123 was already proving to be a violent and chaotic year. There were clashes in Southeast Asia between the nations of Taiyang and Japan, and the Bessarabian War between Giestalvania and Ukraine had not yet finished either. If the Soviets got a hold of Sjælland, it would give them control over the Baltic Sea and an opportunity to project naval power into the Atlantic. As a result, many nations in Europe began preparations for conflict. No nation was as provocative or proactive in this as the Swedish Empire. Within a week, on May 24th, Sweden had declared mobilization and began openly confronting the Russians with the possibility of an expanded war, threatening to intercept Russian ships. Raritania, too, whose Ormil administration regarded the Soviets as the country's arch-rival, began precautionary mobilization on June 10th as Soviet-Swedish tensions continued to rise. By this time, however, the war had expanded in an unexpected direction. On June 9th, the Global Caffeine Federation, an independent corporatocracy based on a series of artificial islands near Rockall, began its own operations against Sigurdheim, independently of the Soviets. On June 12th, Sigurdian forces dug in around Sjælland with support from their navy, as the coming Soviet offensive was deemed a greater danger than the mercenary raids in the Hebrides. However, tensions continued to rise globally, Sweden further mobilizing its forces on June 19th. By this time, the Central Powers, a European alliance of which Sweden was a part, had begun talks of a retaliatory strike to ruin the Soviet plans and weaken the Federation. Diplomats had also been sent to Raritania and the United Boer Republic. On June 22nd, Sigurdheim forces pushed back in the Hebrides while the coalition began to finalize preparations. As tensions rose, anti-war sentiment was growing rapidly in the Soviet Federation, peaking with mass protests on June 28th. However, subsequent events would see this situation effectively reversed with a surge of support. On the 4th of July 2123, the coalition began its operations against the Soviet Federation. On the first day, war was declared by Sweden, Hersbia, Zltanavia, the Neo-Ottoman Empire, Poland, Bulgaria, and Raritania. The Ottomans and Poles began ground offensives, while the Raritanians began bombing raids against Soviet targets, and both Raritanian and Hersbian forces destroyed several Soviet satellites. The Raritanian use of space-based weapons platforms to do so marked the dawn of a new age of orbital warfare, More limited space-to-surface operations had occurred during the Trinitite War of 2117 to 2018 and the Schrödinger crater incident of 2121, but this was the first time in which space-based platforms had engaged each other. In the midst of the mass declarations of war, the Iberians, despite being Russian allies, declared neutrality. The next day, Romania, Severania, and the United Boer Republic also declared war on the Soviet Federation, as did Mundusia for some reason, although this was effectively just symbolic. The Soviets responded to these declarations by warning the coalition to expect an eternity of leaden hell. At the same time, however, the Soviets suffered crippling communications failures as a result of coalition cyber attacks, which were rocking the country. While communications networks in Siberia held out, comms were completely throttled across Europe, with the epicenters being Karelia, Belarus, and the Caucasus. In retaliation, however, Soviet hackers were able to similarly scramble Ottoman air defenses. 2 days later, as clashes broke out in the Baltic and Black Sea regions, two more countries declared war on the Soviets: Egypt and Iran. The Iranians in particular took advantage of intel that the Soviets had left their border undermanned, striking swiftly to take Bukhara and the border regions of Kyrgyzstan and Azerbaijan. Iranian forces also reached Tashkent, beginning what would become the war's longest battle. The next day, the Soviets launched a large-scale counterattack. The Ottomans were pounded with missiles, which also targeted the Suez Canal, Bulgaria, Scandinavia, and Zoltanavia. Soviet anti-satellite and EMP missiles were also launched against Raritanian and Bohr satellites. One disabled the Raritanian shuttle Orbis C Attila, forcing an Apollo 13-style emergency grounding. The Soviet Baltic Fleet, under heavy bombardment from all sides, launched what was essentially a giant kamikaze strike against the Swedish and Sigurdian navies. Casualties were heavy on both sides. Sigurdheim and Sweden each lost a carrier, while the Soviets lost their fleet's battle cruiser, which had been damaged earlier in a Raritanian orbital strike. They used it as a suicide weapon against the Sigurdians. The Soviet Baltic helicopter carrier had already been sunk prior to this operation. On July 13th, with the Sigurdians distracted, the Global Caffeine Federation renewed its operations in the Hebrides. Then, on July 15th, the Severanian forces deployed to Sweden began an offensive towards St. Petersburg, while another cyber attack shut down Soviet air defenses in the Caucasus. Same day, Mexico officially declared neutrality. As this was going on, the Ottomans, Poles, and Iranians continued their own offensives. By the 16th of July, most of Armenia had fallen into Ottoman hands, and the Poles, after taking Brest, pushed on to Hrodna. The next day, forces from the UBR began to arrive on the front lines of Central Asia, while Bulgarian and Ottoman forces in Georgia began fighting to take Tbilisi and Gori, not sure if I'm pronouncing those right, laying siege to the cities. On the 18th, Sigurdian forces began to advance into northern Karelia, while the Sigurdian navy began to wear down the remnants of the Soviet Baltic fleet. This proved to be the prelude to a larger offensive beginning on the 19th. While the Herspians launched massive airstrikes against Soviet forces in the Black Sea and the Caucasus, Zoltanavian troops were redeployed northwards and began pushing towards Murmansk, with naval and air support from Raritania. Raritania also launched orbital strikes in the Black Sea and began bombing Anadyr and other Soviet Pacific ports out of bases in Halvorian, Alaska. This was followed up a day later by Halvoria itself joining the war against the Soviets. On other fronts, the fighting continued. The UBR forces deployed to the Hebrides, and by July 24th had pretty much besieged the GCF forces at Bara. Following this, on the 27th, Swedish forces reached Viborg and began once again pushing towards St. Petersburg. On August 3rd, the Iranian forces took Samarkand. Following this, however, the front lines stagnated for over a month, as little activity occurred, with the exception of slow coalition advances in Karelia, putting them in the suburbs of Murmansk by the first week of September. Some other minor events included a reorganization of Severanian troop deployments on August 22nd, and the Yugoslavian entry into the war with missile strikes against Novorossiysk, Volgograd, and Baku on September 12th. On September 16th, however, all hell broke loose, and the war escalated dramatically as the Soviets unleashed a devastating counteroffensive. 3 nuclear reactors in Murmansk, Brest, and Bukhara were deliberately compromised by Soviet saboteurs, resulting in catastrophic meltdowns. A 4th attempt in Gyumri failed to achieve the same result. Coalition forces were forced to retreat from Bukhara and Murmansk, retreating back to the Norwegian border in the latter case. However, the Soviets themselves suffered heavily from the fallout, particularly in Belarus, where prevailing winds blew the fallout from Brest back into Soviet territory. Meanwhile, in an effort to consolidate their lines, the Soviets pulled out of Vyborg, razing the city behind them. The Soviets also launched major air assaults in Belarus and the Caucasus, and bombarded Herspia with missiles. To deal with this radiological threat, Raritania began donating large amounts of protective equipment and new, uncontaminated supplies to its allies. Raritania had more experience with Soviet radiological tactics than the other coalition nations, and as such had prepared accordingly. On September 19th, Raritanian-aligned saboteurs successfully destroyed a Soviet munitions depot near Arkhangelsk containing large amounts of anti-satellite munitions, and on the same day a Raritanian-led counteroffensive began near Murmansk. Coalition forces pushed back across the border a second time, and Raritanian forces also made landings to the city's north, as naval and air superiority over the region were now nearly absolute. Raritanian shuttles also launched orbital strikes across Siberia. On September 22nd, something unusual happened that expanded the scope of the war further. Albanian forces invaded Yugoslavia, seeking to take Kosovo. Tensions had been rising due to Yugoslav mobilization, and conflict had been inevitable for some time. Meanwhile, something much more sinister had been going on. The authoritarian government of Severania did not have much in common with the coalition ideologically, and as such many officials in the Severanian government had begun passing information to the Soviets from the start. Even at the highest levels, Severania's General Secretary Vasily Wheaton was discovered later to be complicit. By late September, however, the coalition had discovered the leaks and begun closing in. This may have prompted the Severanian leadership to panic, because on September 30th, they outed themselves in a massive betrayal. First, Severanian saboteurs destroyed chemical plants in Herspia to prevent them being used against them. This was followed by a wave of seeming friendly fire incidents, as Severanian troops turned against their allies up and down the front line. This proved especially severe in Karelia and Belarus, halting coalition offensives in these regions. This was followed by the Severanian government openly declaring allegiance to the Soviets. This was not enough to save Murmansk, however, as the coalition made major breakthroughs towards the city in the same day. Sigurdian forces advanced far enough on the city's southern flank to cut its main supply lines and isolate it, while Zoltanavian reinforcements bolstered the offensive elsewhere. In retaliation, the Soviets threatened further escalation, threatening to take no prisoners and to use chemical weapons, with further and more dire attacks should the war continue. These warnings were more or less ignored by the coalition, which had its hands full with the treason of Severania. Retaliation was immediate and devastating. Herspia launched chemical attacks against Severania, and its agents were caught attempting to sabotage Severanian weapons plants. Meanwhile, the very night of the treason, less than 24 hours later, Raritanian special forces conducted the most daring raid of the war, abducting Vasily Wheaton alive from his residence and spiriting him away to The Wall, Raritania's maximum security prison on Jan Mayen. On October 1st, the war expanded further still as the Soviets gained a third ally. Jestlovania declared war and invaded Romania. The same day, Yugoslavian forces launched a counteroffensive in Kosovo. The day after that, retaliation against Severania continued as Sigurdheim launched a massive barrage of missiles. While Romanian forces still scrambled to contain the Jestelivanian spearhead, Iranian forces began to once more advance on Bukhara, laying siege to the city. Most of the Amu Darya delta had fallen into Iranian hands by now as well. October 3rd saw a major win for the coalition as Murmansk finally fell. The same day, Romanian forces launched a counteroffensive against Jestelivania. The next few days were a string of coalition wins, as the GCF began to crumble internally on October 4th, and the Ottomans advanced deeper into Azerbaijan on the 5th, although that same day the Albanians took Prizren. The Russians repeated their declaration that no prisoners would be taken. Finally, on October 6th, Sigurdian special forces captured the leader of the GCF offensive in the Hebrides, prompting a final surrender by the GCF. Later that day, Sigurdheim signed a separate peace deal with the Soviets as well, the Treaty of Escalation. The Soviets nominally surrendered to the Sigurdians, agreeing to a non-aggression pact and a trade deal. Thus, October 6th saw the First Nations leave the war on both sides. For the rest, however, fighting was not even close to finishing. The Treaty of Escalation had only applied to Sigurdheim, and the rest of the coalition was still at war with the Soviets and Severanians. On October 7th, Severania launched an invasion of Zltanavia, crossing the border into Austria and Czechia and opening a new ground front in the war. Severania was quickly retaliated against, however. On October 9th, Raritania launched another major round of orbital strikes against Severania, and also launched missiles against Jestelivania. By this point, the Jestelivanians were already in negotiations with the Romanians and Bulgarians, and the original issue that led to their entry had been resolved. As such, with their capabilities degraded by the missile strikes as well, the Jestelivanians agreed to a ceasefire and were effectively out of the war. On October 11th, the Polish push against Russia resumed as radiation levels fell. The next day, Yugoslavia launched Operation Iron Ring against Albania, pushing back. Sigurdheim also rejoined the war with a missile strike against Severania, because Severanian fighters had attacked Sigurdian troops withdrawing from the front line after the Treaty of Escalation. A week later, on the 19th, Albania launched Operation Black Eagle, halting the Yugoslavian counteroffensive and pushing to Gyakova. At the same time, Sigurdheim launched an even larger barrage of 50 missiles at Severania. By the 21st, the situation was falling apart completely for Severania, as pockets of Severanian troops had been once again caught behind Polish lines and began to surrender en masse. October ended not with an act of war, however, but of triumph for all humanity. On October 26th, Raritania landed Kylonauts on Mars, the first manned mission to the planet in over 25 years. By November, the war was going pretty solidly in favor of the coalition. The Soviets had lost the gains from the September counteroffensive, the situation for Severania was rapidly deteriorating, and the GCF had been knocked out of the war entirely. By November 1st, the UBR had reached full mobilization and began to deploy troops to the front lines in numbers not previously seen, beyond what Russia could keep up with. By November 8th, the Soviet Navy had been largely driven out of the Bering Sea, and the Severanians were forced to go on the defensive in Zltanavia on November 12th. Only Albania, which was really fighting its own independent war against just Yugoslavia, was still making any advances, finally taking Gyakova on the 13th after Yugoslavian forces burned the city and retreated. That same day, Raritanian military officials apprehended several Severanian spies attempting to break into the Wall and release Vasily Huitin. This seemingly laughable failure was actually a serious flashpoint, however, as if they had succeeded in breaking into the prison, it would have been considered a provocation of Raritania's Jan Mayen doctrine, potentially leading to a Raritanian nuclear strike on Severania. The next day, Albanian forces captured Pristina in a daring airborne assault, and Yugoslavia threw in the towel. Kosovo was surrendered on the 15th, and Yugoslavia turned its focus north to Severania. Severania had attempted to frame Yugoslavia for its betrayal, and the hatred between the two had become especially bitter. On November 17th, the Zltanavian forces launched a large-scale counterattack against Severania's crumbling lines, the Yugoslavian Air Force obliterated Frankfurt and Munich with a pair of massive incendiary air raids. That same day, reports also announced the discovery of a new kind of bacteria called Arthemarathanatos, causing a strange new illness among infected soldiers on a certain section of the front in Belarus. Symptoms included gangrene, high fevers, blindness, and hallucinations, generally taking the form of apocalyptic visions. Yikes. Oh, and it was also immune to most antibiotics. Thankfully, it wasn't very fast spreading and was generally not fatal in and of itself. As this was happening, tensions had been rising across the Atlantic. The United Caribbean Republic had been a UEC member before the war, and while they did not join with the Soviets, they continued to support them diplomatically, and thousands of UCR citizens had volunteered to fight for the Soviets and their allies. This, combined with their increasingly leftist government led by Frederick Gutzman and Lucille Daughtery, put them at odds with Raritania. The last straw came when the UCR tried to convince Raritania to allow them to attack Mexico, a neutral nation. In response, Raritania finally declared war on November 19th, storming out of Guantanamo Bay with over 40,000 of the country's most elite troops, and captured Frederick Gutzman in a daring raid on Havana. The next day, Sigurdian forces joined in, landing in the Bay of Pigs and bombing much of Cuba. Back in Europe, the Soviets and their allies were growing desperate. On November 24th, Herspian special forces destroyed many of Severania's remaining air defenses, and Boer forces deployed to Europe broke through the Severanian defensive lines the next day. In response, Severania launched massive chemical weapon attacks against civilian targets in Yugoslavia on November 26th. By now, the Soviets had abandoned the Kola Peninsula and retreated to Kandalaksha, and were focused primarily on reinforcing Tashkent against the Iranians and preventing an AU offensive over the Bering Sea. However, on November 26th, the same day as the Severanian chemical strikes, the Soviets launched their last major attack of the war. Several more reactors were detonated in the Caucasus, and the Soviets prepared to fight another brutal battle near Minsk. They also had one last ace up their sleeve in the form of an ingenious naval attack. Iberia, though officially neutral, had somehow been convinced to loan its navy to the Soviets in secret, and now the Soviets unleashed havoc against the Herspian fleet in the Mediterranean. But by this point, the war was spiraling beyond either side's control. Horrifyingly, hundreds of thousands were dying in the cities of Yugoslavia. Belgrade, Sarajevo, Podgorica, Ljubljana, and Novi Sad had all been hit with devastating chemical attacks that had killed thousands and left hundreds of thousands more without water, medical care, or any emergency services, or any way to escape from the spreading clouds of poisonous gas. The Yugoslavian government retaliated in the only way they could. The following day, on November 27, 2123, 11 tactical nuclear missiles rained down on Severanian cities, including Frankfurt and Munich. Several million people were killed. The Severanian leadership was broken, and the survivors, including Wheaton's successor, Sinarov Knight, went into hiding in bomb shelters. 5 years prior, the Trinitite War had leveled China, killing half its population. Now Europe was on the brink of meeting the same fate. Emergency negotiations began between the coalition and the Soviets, and a ceasefire was put into place. 1 week after the nuclear exchange, a pair of treaties were signed in Russia and Raritania that put an end to the war. The Treaty of Moscow saw Russia surrender to Raritania and the coalition. The terms, primarily negotiated by Raritanian diplomats, were more lenient than many coalition members had wanted, leading to a bit of a rift between the allies post-war. The treaty included the following terms. The Soviets had to cede Vyborg and Petsamo to the Swedish Empire. Soviets had to cede western Belarus to Poland. The Western Caucasus were divided between Bulgaria, the Ottomans, and Iran. Parts of Kyrgyzstan were ceded to Iran. The car company Lada was transferred to Zoltanavia, and Raritania re-established its observatory in Franz Josef Land, And finally, the Soviets had to pay $150 billion in gold as reparations. At the same time, the Treaty of Betlikol was signed in Raritania, formalizing the surrender of the UCR. The UCR was forced to ban communist and fascist political parties and agree to a 10-year NAP with Raritania, during which it could not wage war without Raritanian oversight and approval. Raritania also kept several captured ships as war prizes. In exchange, Frederick Gutzman was released from the Wall. Lastly, Vasily Wheaton, who had been imprisoned in the Wall since October, was tried for his crimes, with the trial concluding on December 18th. He was accused of violating a treaty, war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, conspiracy to commit war crimes, conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, and crimes against liberty. The charge of crimes against peace for the invasion of Austria was dropped. Senarov Knight was determined to be guilty of the act, not Wheaton. The charge of crimes against humanity was also dropped as it was essentially a duplicate of the war crimes charge. Of the other 5 charges, he was convicted of 4: treaty violation, war crimes, conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, and crimes against liberty. For the conviction of war crimes, Wheaton was sentenced to death. To avoid another escape attempt, as there were hints that his supporters might attempt it, he was executed just a week later, on Christmas Day 2125. In the aftermath of the war, several nations collapsed on both sides. Among the coalition, Yugoslavia collapsed not long after the war ended, and Sigurtheim split in half between Britain and Scandinavia. Meanwhile, the GCF had collapsed well before the war even ended, and Soviet President Alexander Rurik was forced to flee, briefly exiling himself to an unknown location before returning as the head of the newly reorganized Confederacy of Russia. Severania suffered most of all. With most of its infrastructure destroyed, Severania was torn by violence between pro-democratic revolutionaries and supporters of Senarov Knight's regime, eventually devolving into an all-out civil war as rebuilding efforts failed. The conflict dragged on until the revolutionaries finally overcame the communist SNA in May of 2126 with foreign support. The treaty that ended the war also caused significant contention and controversy, most prominently with Sweden. The Swedes began to conduct ethnic cleansings of their new territories, prompting the Russians to launch a renewed offensive by 2124. This time they were met with virtually no international opposition, as Sweden's actions had made it a virtual pariah state almost overnight. This war has, as of the time of recording, continued on and off to the present. As of 2126, nearly 3 years after its end, the effects of the Red War have still yet to reach their resolution. Severania has only just begun to reunify and rebuild. The Russians and Swedes are still skirmishing in Karelia, and the UCR is still bound to Raritania under the Treaty of Betlikol. Only time will tell what developments the future will bring. Thank you all for watching.